Okay, so we have explored a lot about inflation so far. Now we're going to turn our attention over to a specific mechanism that we use to deal with the consequences of inflation, which is the indexing. We talked about indexing a little bit already, but let's look more about how it works and some of its limitations. All right, so our learning outcomes explain the relationship between indexing and inflation and identify 3 ways the government can control inflation through macroeconomic policy decisions. So let's start with an understanding of what indexing means. Indexing is the mechanism where wages, prices, or interest rates are automatically adjusted for inflation. Let me say that again. Indexing is when we automatically adjust wages that we pay our employees, or minimum wages, for instance, prices, maybe we adjust prices by the consumer price index, or interest rates, automatically adjusted for inflation. So in essence, an indexed payment to any of those 3 categories increases according to this index number that is being used to measure inflation. We looked at index numbers earlier, but this is using those index numbers to automatically adjust prices or payments in wages, prices, and interest rates. So indexing helps us to offset the inflation's negative effects across different parts of the economy. So think about this. I mean, inflation is particularly harmful when it affects parts of the economy, but not other parts of the economy. So for instance, if prices rise, but wages don't keep up, people's purchasing power erodes. Indexing is helpful to mitigate that problem. We don't have to have a conversation with our boss about a cost of living adjustment. It'll just happen automatically if we index it to the consumer price index. Does that make sense? So indexing just helps to ensure that when one area of our economy starts to increase, then so do other areas of our economy to make up for that between those wages, prices, and interest rates. So let's see how this plays out in the private marketplace. We see examples of this, like cost of living adjustments. They're not always guaranteed. They're not always automatic, but sometimes they are. Sometimes we put cost of living adjustments in our contracts that we sign when we take a job. And sometimes you can ask for a cost of living adjustment in your employment contract. That makes it automatic, or it makes it enforceable. So cost of living adjustments ensure that wages keep up with inflation. A contract might include a clause that says, wages will increase by the cost of living adjustment plus 3%, for instance. This gives workers protection if inflation rises unexpectedly. And you can try to negotiate this on your own. You can try to negotiate this as through a labor union. They will often do things like this. Then there's things like adjustable rate mortgages. Adjustable rate mortgages are loans where the interest rate varies with inflation. And this helps the lender, the bank, avoid losing real income due to inflation. Borrowers can sometimes benefit because they're getting lower initial rates on their ARMs or their adjustable rate mortgages because of the reduced inflation risk for the lenders. Now, I will caution you on this. Actually, I'm gonna be really clear on this. If you haven't already done this in your lifetime, if you've never bought a home, when you go to look for buying a home, banks are going to want to quote you 2 different rates. One is going to be a fixed interest rate. The other one's going to be an adjustable rate mortgage. So you have 2 options. You can take the fixed interest rate. You can take the adjustable interest rate. Now, it's going to be your choice. But the way that we've seen the volatility with inflation over the last few years, and the way, not just inflation, but the way that the Federal Reserve has reacted to inflation. When inflation is high, right, the Federal Reserve increases interest rates. And that is what triggers the adjustable rate mortgage increases. It's not inflation. It's the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates. And those increased interest rates drive the adjustable rate mortgage interest rates. And as those interest rates goes up from 1 month to the next, or from 1 quarter to the next, or from 1 year to the next, your mortgage payment increases. It doesn't stay flat. It doesn't stay the same. If you bought a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, your payment is never going to change. It is always going to be whatever it was calculated to be when you signed the loan, when you did the amortization schedule. It will stay the same for decades. But the adjustable rate mortgage, that interest rate is going to change depending on what the Federal Reserve is doing, and they are reacting to inflation. So if you like the idea of that, go for it. Most people like that consistency. Banks prefer the adjustable rate mortgages because, again, they're able to reduce their risk. They're passing the risk off to you. You're taking on the risk of the interest rates changing over time with that adjustable rate mortgage. So it's just something to be aware of. And a lot of it depends on when you are going to buy your home. Are you buying at a point in time where interest rates are high? If you're buying at a time where interest rates are high, you're going to be stuck at that interest rate for decades, right, in a 30-year mortgage, unless you refinance your home sometime in the future. If you're buying when interest rates are low, like I did in 2015, I was lucky, then that interest rate's low, and I don't know that interest rates will be that low again in a very long time. So if interest rates are low, that fixed rate becomes much more attractive. When interest rates are high, that adjustable rate becomes much more attractive. You have to take in all those factors, but it is a big decision to be made. And you have to understand that the adjustable rate mortgage, the risk of interest rate changes due to inflation are passed off to you. The bank saves that risk. They don't have to take that risk. You take that risk. So you have to be very careful with things like this. But that's an example of indexing. The rate that you pay on your mortgage payment each month is indexed automatically with the rate of the Federal Reserve in the marketplace, and it changes, your payment changes. Okay. And then the last one here, last example will be inflation adjusted contracts. So there's a lot of contracts that adjust for goods and services. They may have clauses that adjust prices according to inflation. Again, just like a payment contract, just like a wage contract between a business and employee, there could be other types of contracts from business to business, from buyers and sellers. All right. We also use indexing with our tax brackets and other government programs. So for tax brackets, we do this thing called, we want to prevent bracket creep. And that's where rising incomes that are due to only because of inflation push people into higher tax brackets. We're not trying to push people into higher tax brackets just because they got a cost of living adjustment, right? So we adjust income tax brackets for inflation as well. And since 1981, tax thresholds in the United States have automatically increased with inflation. It's not a political football. It's not something the IRS thinks about every month and changes whenever they want to. It's set to an index. It automatically increases, has for decades. Social Security is similar. So Social Security benefits are adjusted annually with the Consumer Price Index. So there is this intention that Social Security payments for people who are retired, it may not be their 100% of their income. Maybe they're getting some pension, maybe they're getting some 401k money, but that Social Security money that they receive, it's adjusted annually with the Consumer Price Index to help them maintain their purchasing power, right? So that can be good. We want to make sure that people who are on fixed incomes are not disproportionately affected by inflation to the extent that we can. Payroll taxes do the same thing. So there is one payroll tax is Social Security, and there is a cap on Social Security. After a certain amount of earnings, it's a ridiculously high number, but in the calendar year, I think right now it's something like $168,000. If you earn more than $168,000, you will stop paying Social Security. You will hit the cap. And that cap, that $168,000, next year it'll be $172,000. Year after that it'll be $176,000. It automatically adjusts with inflation. It is indexed to some kind of inflation metric. I don't know which one, but that's Social Security. Not all of them do that. Unemployment does that, but that's a payroll tax that employers pay, not that businesses pay. All right. Actually, no, unemployment is not indexed. I take that back. Social Security is. Medicare, there's no cap, so Medicare is not indexed. Government bonds. So government bonds, there can be indexed bonds that offer fixed interest rates above inflation. So yeah. Talking a little bit more about the minimum wage. I mean, this is something that personally makes me upset. The federal minimum wage in the United States is flawed. It really is. It has been $7.25, at least it is right now. This is November 2024. It has been $7.25 for my entire working career, minus a very short time when I was making like $5.60 working at Drug Emporium when I was like 16, 17 years old. Minus a small amount of my working time, it has been $7.25 and it has not changed. And I'm not saying that wages haven't increased. Obviously, wages have increased in all of that time because businesses have to stay competitive. But we don't really have a perfectly competitive labor market. That's a myth. It sounds great when you read it in an economics textbook, but when you look out in the real world, it doesn't exist. It's not here. We don't have such a thing. And so wages are not automatically rising to keep up with the cost of living just because employers are nice to their employees. It just doesn't happen. So this video does a really good job of exploring this concept that the minimum wage is a political football. Democrats run on the increasing minimum wage. Republicans run on keeping it the same. They want the market to determine that. Neither of them are right. Neither of them are right, in my opinion. And I'm being very opinionated on this, but neither of them are right. The minimum wage in this country needs to be removed from politics. It needs to stop being a political football. It needs to be indexed to the consumer price index. And there have been many studies. There's other countries that do this. There have been studies to show that there is basically no effect on inflation when minimum wage is set to increase a little bit each year. Minimum wage comes through the tail end. Now, I'm not saying it won't have some effect on inflation. Anytime you raise wages, it's going to raise inflation too. But the studies that have been done show that it's so minimal. And it would be a small increase year over year over year over year, rather than this political football where it's been $7.25 for my entire adult working career, basically. So watch this video on your own time. It's really good. It explains this. Some states have done this. Ohio is one example. Ohio lawmakers indexed their minimum wage to rise with inflation every single year. And so that ensures the wages are keeping pace with the cost of living without waiting for political gridlock to resolve that. Now, Ohio's minimum wage is not a livable wage. It doesn't respect the principles that we passed the minimum wage on back in the 1930s, but it's at least indexed. That's a massive improvement over it staying stagnant all this time. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but that's something I feel pretty strongly about. And this video, I think, is really worth watching. All right, so indexing has its advantages. It also has some limitations, okay? So just like I just talked about a second ago, with indexing in place, the people who are protected from the impacts of inflation, like people on pensions and banks, with the indexing, right, there's a little more protection for them, but it means that they might be less concerned about rising prices. So it can kind of create a sense of complacency, and it may cause delays in some necessary actions that help to root the causes of inflation. We don't want banks getting complacent, right? So if banks are passing a lot of adjustable rate mortgages, they're passing the burden of the inflation, the burden of interest rate changes onto you as the consumer. They're not going to be willing to do a whole lot of changes when inflation starts to go up, because it's not their problem. It's now your problem. It's not their problem. And we generally don't see that as a positive. I mean, we want our institutions to be able to react timely when necessary. And importantly, indexing is often partial. So it doesn't always fully shield everyone from the effects of inflation. Those without indexed contracts, like wage earners and small business owners, they're particularly vulnerable to the erosion of purchasing power that's caused by inflation. Not everyone is available, not everyone has that indexing benefit. And indexing can lead to social implications. Those who are financially savvy enough to protect themselves against inflation through indexed contracts, through negotiating automatic cost of living adjustments, through working in a union with union reps who do that automatically, right? Some of us have that and some of us don't. And so that widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots, which exacerbates income inequality. So we have to be careful on that. All right, so let's shift gears. Let's recap some of the key points about the causes of inflation, right? The core cause of inflation is there's same problem in economics as there's always been. There's too many dollars chasing too few goods, right? That's the fundamental driver of inflation. Too much money chasing not enough stuff, not enough goods. And we saw that during the pandemic, especially, right? During the pandemic, we had stimulus money. People had money in their pocket. The government was asking us to spend it, but the supply chains were shut down. We couldn't get stuff. Things that we used to have imported in, those overseas factories were shut down. The drivers weren't moving for a little while. I mean, they got back to work. I'm not trying to trash anybody. The longshoremen on the docks, the cargo ships were just sitting out at sea for months, and so there was this massive supply chain disruption. We had stimulus money happening, but not enough goods to buy those things. And so we have inflation. And not just because of the supply chain disruptions, but also in the guise of inflation, we also see businesses who are seeing that getting scared. The businesses are getting scared. And so they're padding the inflation with profits to offset the uncertainty of the future. And so inflation was driven even further. But ultimately, too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's the fundamental driver. It's not just because companies got greedy. It's also just because supply and demand. That's the main thing, supply and demand. All right. So some of the historical causes, though, right? Wars lead to high inflation. There's increased government spending, which is stimulus. And then there's shortages because there's shortages, followed by post-war spending surges. Economic downturns like the Great Depression typically reduce inflation or even lead to deflation because spending power tends to fall, right? And so we have to consider the boom and bust cycle. A control strategy for inflation is to balance purchasing power growth with production growth. We need to make sure that purchasing power, people who have money, people who can buy goods and services, is balanced with the ability to produce those goods and services. We're looking for that equilibrium. That equilibrium is crucial so that we avoid excess demand because excess demand is what fuels inflation. And then there are some macroeconomic policies, taxation, interest rates. Those are things that we can do to help manage inflation. Interest rates are the main thing that we do to help manage inflation. We don't change tax policy all that often, but we do change interest rates on a regular basis. That's what the Federal Reserve does. It's one of their big mandates. Okay, so we've talked about some of the economic complexities of inflation. Let's talk about some of the different perspectives of the public, how the public feel, and how economists feel about why inflation is important. We talked about this a bit, right? The public worries about inflation. They worry about the loss of purchasing power. They don't want this widening wage gap. They don't want their wages to stay stagnant while their costs are increasing. They're worried about how much money they can, the kitchen table economics. So price of groceries increases faster than the price of wages. People feel that pinch in their everyday lives. Economists view modest inflation, 2 to 4%, as manageable. They think moderate inflation helps to avoid the economic risks of deflation. Okay, so the key here is to ensure that inflation aligns with improvements in living standards. If we can balance the inflation with people's living standards, then we can maintain our economic stability. So the last slide here, the last thing to bring it home is, just talking about the COVID-19 pandemic a little bit more. COVID-19 brought some unexpected surge in inflation. And I talked about this a second ago. It was really driven by a perfect storm of supply chain disruptions, increased demand because of stimulus checks, mainly because of stimulus checks, and overall shifts in economic behavior. So factories were shutting down. We had global shipping delays. We had shortages for essential items, which pushed up prices for goods like cars and gas and groceries. At the same time, government stimulus checks were expanding benefits. The stimulus checks and the unemployment stimulus on top of that, if you were on unemployment, you got additional money each week. Those expanded benefits put more money in consumers' hands, which boosted demand because they've got money and the government's telling you, spend this money. We're giving it to you for a reason. We're giving it to you because we want you to spend it, right? But got all this money, but supply was constrained. There wasn't much to spend it on. We couldn't go out. We're stuck inside our house. So what are we going to spend it on? A lot of people chose to spend it on home renovations. But then the price of lumber started to skyrocket because what do you need for home renovations? You need a lot of wood. You need a lot of lumber. So this imbalance between the available supply and the demand, the money that we have demanding that we're trying to spend, but we don't have the supply. It's not coming in. We're not getting it off the container ships fast enough. We're not getting off the trucks fast enough. The factories are shutting down. The supply chain's shutting down. But we got all this money we need to spend. And so as we got through this variance between the two, this imbalance, it created inflationary pressures, unlike we've seen in recent decades. And I mean, I saw it firsthand because I was the price setter for my organization, the company that I worked for. We did a lot of importing. We imported picture frame moldings and we imported all of that stuff. And we saw our supplies dwindle down to very little. You know, the inventory that we had at one point, I think 50%, no, I think it was worse than that. I think it was 70% of all of our SKUs were out of stock. We had 30% of our product line that we had stock on, and it was the 30% that nobody really wanted that often. It was not the best sellers. We were out of 70% of our inventory. We had it on order. We were waiting on it to come in, but it was taking months and months and months. And not only that, the manufacturers who were making it for us and importing it from overseas started giving us price increases. So we took those price increases from our overseas manufacturers, from our domestic manufacturers, from all of our suppliers, the entire supply chain. All these price increases are coming down because, right, nobody's got product. And there's all this demand for product, especially in the home goods market. Like I said, home renovations, people redesigning their houses because what's happened, they no longer work in the office. Now they work at home. Right? Now they work at home. And so they're trying to renovate their homes. They're putting money into their houses. They think that's a safe investment for them. They're going to see some return on that. But also they're spending more time in their homes instead of their offices or instead of their workplace. So they're spending their time fixing things up. Right? So they're buying things like picture frames. They're buying wood. They're buying hardware. And a lot of that stuff is just in short supply. There's not enough available. Paint. There was a supply shortage in paint. People couldn't paint their houses. They couldn't find it. There wasn't enough available. Price increases started to come, and everything started to go up. And in the midst of all that, not just in that, this one industry, but in every industry, in the midst of all these price increases, there was fear. There was this fear that we don't know. We don't know when the pandemic's going to be over. We don't know when we're going to get back to normal. We don't know what normal is anymore. Now it's going to be now it's going to be cold, flu, and COVID season. COVID's going to be here to stay. I mean, we were all afraid. In my position as someone who was setting prices, meaning I was making price lists, I was taking in all the information from all these manufacturers. When they gave us a 5% price increase, we took a 6% price increase. We didn't just take the 5%. We went above that. We did a bigger price increase. We passed a bigger price increase on to our customers. And we did that because we were afraid of what was going to happen. And we thought we need a little bit more. And since they're giving us a price increase anyway, we have no control over it. We're going to pad that a little bit so that we can get a little bit more for us to offset future losses that we aren't sure are going to happen or not. Well, every industry is a little different in how they handled this, but I guarantee you, That is what every industry did. They all padded those price increases from the manufacturers, or even just not even from the manufacturers, but they all padded those price increases higher and higher and higher, and that trickled through the supply chain down to you as the end consumer. So you as the end consumer are paying the ultimate high price, whereas everybody else has padded that a little bit. And I don't have the data in front of me, but we know from the studies on this that corporate profits during the pandemic increased dramatically from the years prior. And we can attribute, I believe one metric was that about 50% of the inflation during the pandemic is attributed to corporate profits, the rise in corporate profits, because of this padding effect, because of price setters like me who were afraid of what was going to happen in the future. So we padded those price increases that we got from our supply chain, and we passed them down the line. So the pandemic, it was a special time. It was different. The effects of that inflation was long lasting. We are finding ourselves having a soft landing, right? We're having a soft landing right now, and that's something that's never been done before. But I want you to understand that inflation happens in a world where people are scared, and it happens just as a regular course of business. Really, it does. And it's just something to be aware of. When you look at who wins and who loses, you want to be on the side that wins. There's going to be a disproportion. There's going to be a change in wealth. There's going to be a wealth transfer. No matter how you look at it, there's going to be a wealth transfer. You want to be on the side that wins. You want to have a fixed rate mortgage instead of an adjustable rate mortgage if you're trying to not take on the risks of inflation, right? But only do that if it makes sense for you. If the interest rate's too high, maybe it doesn't make sense for you. Maybe you take the adjustable rate mortgage and you refinance when interest rates start to lower. But no one can predict the future. No one knows what's going to happen. But don't let your money sit in a bank account where it's not going to earn any interest, right? Plan ahead. Be a winner when it comes to inflation. Do those things that make sense. All right. So that's going to end my TED Talk. Sorry, this went a little bit longer than I expected. But that is going to conclude this chapter on inflation. And I will see you all in the next one.